Hey folks, in this video what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the organelles and what they do. I like to split them into three categories. There are organelles that make things that the cell is going to use. There are organelles that move those things to where they're needed, because you can imagine a protein might be made in the cytoplasm, but it might need to go to the cell membrane. And there are organelles that break things down. These are things that could be broken or even toxic to the cell. So let's see what those organelles are. So let's look at the makers. Out here in red, we've got the mitochondria, and the mitochondria are involved in making ATP. Towards the end of the course, we're going to learn the process by which they do that. But basically know that what your cells are doing is they're taking glucose or other molecules, they can do this with fats and proteins as well, and they're turning those molecules into ATP. That ATP can be used for everything from running one of those little ion channel pumps to making your muscles contract. It's a really important molecule for your body. And it's even used by bacteria to get their flagella to move so that they can swim. Plant cells not only have mitochondria, but they also have chloroplasts, and the chloroplasts enable them to use the sun to create energy, ATP. Again, we'll be learning how they do that. When we go in from that, we have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is involved in synthesizing lipids and hormones. This is what would be used if the cell wanted to make more cell membrane. Maybe it's growing or something, and it needs to synthesize those phospholipids. That would be an example. Or remember that hormones are signals that your cells are using all the time to talk to each other. Even bacteria, which are sort of lone wolf single cell organisms, will use signals that they'll send to each other so that they know where to sort of aggregate. When we go past that, we get to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And you might say, well, why is this called a rough endoplasmic reticulum? Well, when I zoom in, hopefully you can see all those little purple dots on that rough endoplasmic reticulum. That's what makes it rough. And what those purple dots are is those are ribosomes. That endoplasmic reticulum is studded with ribosomes. Those ribosomes, remember, are where that mRNA feeds in and is used to make proteins. The same happens in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. It's used to synthesize proteins. Whoops. And these proteins can be channels, they can be enzymes, they can be all manner of things. When we go past that, we get to the nucleus. And the nucleus contains the cell's genetic material. This is the DNA, and this DNA is sort of like the blueprint. It's used to build proteins, it's used to build new cells. It kind of tells the cell what to do. Remember that in an animal cell like this, the genetic material will be in the nucleus. However, in a bacterial cell, there is no nucleus, so the DNA will be free floating. Now, we've talked about the ribosomes and that they're used to make proteins, but where do those ribosomes come from? And it turns out within the nucleus, there's this area called the nucleolus. And the nucleolus is involved in the synthesis of ribosomes. So it contains ribosomal RNA, which is used to make those ribosomes. All right, so let's look at what kinds of organelles are in each of our cell types. So we have animal cells and plant cells. These are our eukaryotes. And then we have bacteria, and those are prokaryote. Now the first organelle we looked at the mitochondria. Animal cells have mitochondria. Plant cells also have mitochondria. Bacterial cells do not have any membrane-bound organelles, so they do not have mitochondria. And you might think, well, how do they make energy? Well, it turns out that instead they use a process called glycolysis, which we're going to learn about in a couple weeks, and you use it as well. When we look at our plant cells have chloroplasts. These take sun energy, and they use that sun energy to make ATP. Animal cells have no chloroplasts, and bacteria have no chloroplasts. When we move further into the cell with those makers, we get to the smooth ER. Animal cells have a smooth endoplasmic reticulum. In us, it's predominantly used to synthesize lipids and hormones. Plants have one as well, and in them it's predominantly used to synthesize carbohydrates, which are their chosen storage molecules. Of course, yours can synthesize carbohydrates as well. It's just sort of biased a little bit more that way in plants. And again, bacteria have no membrane-bound organelles, so they have no smooth ER. The bacteria list is going to be super easy to remember. The next one is the rough ER, which is that sort of studded with the ribosomes to make proteins. Animals have rough ER. Plant cells also need to make proteins, so they have a rough ER. Bacteria, again, no membrane-bound organelles, so no rough ER. When we go to ribosomes, that's what makes the rough ER rough. And remember, the mRNA feeds into those ribosomes, and that's how we make proteins. You have ribosomes in your animal cells. Ribosomes are also found in plant cells. And when we get to the bacteria also have ribosomes. Ribosomes are not a membrane-bound organelle, so the bacteria can have them. When we head on a little bit more inwards to the nucleus, you have a nucleus. That's where you keep your DNA. Plant cells also have a nucleus. And again, that's where they keep their DNA. Remember, in bacteria, the DNA is not membrane bound, so they don't really have a nucleus. What they sometimes have is what's called a nucleolar region, which is sort of like the region that the DNA is in, but it's kind of floating in the cytoplasm in those bacteria. All right. Now inside that nucleus, you also have a nucleolus, which is used to create ribosomes. And guess what? Plant cells, since they also have ribosomes, have a nucleolus. So for now, I want to highlight the differences, all right? Now, when I'm highlighting the differences over here, I'm going to highlight the heck out of bacteria, right? Because there's just a lot of missing stuff. And when we go to plant cells are honestly quite similar to animal cells. The big difference is that we don't have chloroplasts and they do. Now, that doesn't mean that we have the same amount of every organelle. Different types of cells, even within your body, are going to have different numbers of organelles. For example, your neurons use a lot of ATP. And one of the hallmarks of neurons is that they have a buttload of mitochondria because they need a way to create all that ATP. And it's a little bit better to do it locally. Now, what I'm presenting here is a generalization. There are photosynthetic bacteria which do have chloroplasts. And when we look at animal cells, you do have cells such as your red blood cells, which actually do not have a nucleus because while they are developing, they eject their nucleus so that they'll have more room to basically absorb oxygen. So there are some exceptions to these rules, but this is a general rule of looking at cellular anatomy.